All right. Thank you, Rich. We've already got a question for you, and I think probably a lot of people have this question, and we've discussed this even in preparation for this meeting. One of the attendees asks, basically, he's interested in you clarifying the difference between certification and approval and what agencies do what.
Okay, that's a good question. An approval has been issued by the U.S. Bureau of Mines and NIOSH, and it very clearly starts with the identification of a hazard, its intended use, and then creates a variety of different standards that the product would have to meet to ensure that the wearer of that equipment is safe. And by, as I said, 1972, it was clearly recognized and added into the approval requirements the need for a respiratory protection program. So approval has a regulatory underpinning, where conformity assessment certification is a private sector process with an independent third party who will make the declaration that specified standards are met. They do not have the authority to change the standards according to their own interpretation. It's a private sector organization that makes that declaration, and there's not necessarily a specific link all the way back through to the hazard, and there should be if it's going to be considered an approval. And there are a number of organizations that issue certifications, SEI, UL. There's a number of private sector organizations who issue third-party certifications for a variety of products.
And related to that, Rich, just comment on who does the approval for the device. Which agency?
Oh, the agency for the approval currently is NIOSH for occupationally used respirators, but there's a joint approval for respirators that are used for mine emergency applications. In those applications, NIOSH and the Mine Safety and Health Administration issue a joint approval. For other occupationally used respirators, NIOSH alone issues the approval. And incidentally, NIOSH conducts all of the conformity assessment activities itself. It currently does not use accredited third-party certifiers or laboratories in conducting its approval program.
Okay. I'm going to ask you, we have another question from the audience, but Rich, I'm going to ask you one first, because I think the one I'll ask is easier than this one. So we're talking about two different potential user groups outside the usual population that NIOSH has focused upon in their conformity assessment activities. So given this group that we're calling non-traditional users, you've already said in your slides that you thought that the current NIOSH approach is still applicable. Given that we're not even sure, at least in some situations, we'd have to know what group that is we're talking about, and I would presume that there would be barriers to applying the usual NIOSH approach if there was insufficient information about risk assessment or what is it we're protecting them from. So could you say a little bit about, even though you think this would work, the current NIOSH approach, what the barriers to that would be, or what wrinkles would have to be ironed out?
Well, I think one of the first barriers is the struggle that the country constantly has with regard to personal freedom versus community protection. And there'll be resistance to adding any additional federal sort of coordination or oversight over the broad conformity assessment for respirators that might be used by the public. The oversight that I would be suggesting would be an oversight to provide coordination, not to provide the individuals on equipment used by the public. That should be done private sector conformity assessment system, just like the National Academies or the NRC recommended in 1996. But there needs, I believe, to be a central federal organization who could be the recognized authority to pull all the information together to make sure that these decentralized certification programs or even self-declaration type programs are achieving their objectives. And where they're not, NIOSH could perform assessments and identify proper corrective action to warn the public of concerns.
So I think you wandered into the second question that I was trying to protect you from because I think it was tough. So the first question, the one I asked you, was about the non-traditional worker user. But one of our participants wrote in and asked the parallel question about NIOSH's role in conjunction with private sector and conformity assessment for the public users, which you kind of got into. Do you see a difference between the non-traditional occupational users and the public users?
Unfortunately, I think we've learned the first 50 years of the last century that when there isn't a respiratory protection program with proper elements of hazard identification, respirator selection, training, respirator certification or approval, and so on, we know from the first 50 years that U.S. Bureau of Mines respirators, although they were conforming, when they were used improperly, did not deliver the intended protection. There were many research projects that showed that workers were being overexposed, even though they were using the U.S. Bureau of Mines approved respirator. So it's very important. And I say it's unfortunate because I think that there's a lot of people who think that because the public just doesn't need to be protected with a respiratory protection program in addition to using a conforming respirator. And if you do that, you're going back to where we were 50 years ago. It would be an unfortunate step to take, I believe.
All right, we have time for more questions. If you would, participants like to type into the Q&A box. Also happy to take questions from any other of the panel members.
Yeah, let me, Melissa, can I ask a question?
Yes, Howard, go ahead.
So as you went through this, what I think I understand is that really we start off with identifying a hazard. And that hazard needs to result in a standard, and then we'll have conformity assessment for that standard if it's picked right. But I think traditionally we think of standards as to the device, and what you brought up appropriately is there's really two standards. One is a standard of care for using the device, and one is the device itself. And so that probably is something that if we get into non-traditional workers or the public, and I think you've said it well, really needs to be emphasized. It's very easy to look at a respirator, pull one out and say, well, this is an N95 NIOSH approved respirator, and we're good to go. And in fact, there is more than needed. And somehow that needs to, as you say, through a central authority, whether it's NIOSH or someone else, needs to come through to say, no, if you're buying this device by itself, the device won't protect you. It's how you're going to use it that's going to work together. Am I saying that correct, Rich?
Yes, and let me just say one other thing that you mentioned. You mentioned the word authority, and I may have said authority several times in my talk, but it can be different authorities. It can be, for example, we know that DOJ properly is involved in body armor and NFPA in fire service equipment. So you can have multiple authorities that can provide the needed recommendations and continuity within the program. A central authority could eliminate inconsistencies in implementation across the board in the nation. The other thing I want to say is, I was involved in developing 42 CFR 84, the current approval requirements, and we removed the 30 CFR 11, that was a 1972 regulation. We removed the requirement in that regulation for a respiratory protection program. And we removed that requirement because we knew that OSHA and MSHA and DOE and others all were already using either nationally consensus respiratory protection program requirements or were in regulations. So we didn't need it. And sometimes I regret removing it because I think it's nice to have it connected with the approval so that you see that it's not just the conformance that confers protection, but it's the protection program and coupled with the conformity assessment on the respirator that confers protection.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going through the Q&As here, and a whole bunch of them are about COVID, which we have not talked about yet and is not the focus of this workshop, but doesn't mean we won't get into some of this as we move more deeply into the program in the next 2 days. I see one that we need to clarify. Someone asks, what is a non-traditional worker? Probably that's we were misspeaking. We mean non-traditional users of respirators. And we have got a performance definition from that, which is awkward. We agree, which is people who are using respirators outside of a respiratory protection program, which is something Rich was just talking about. Let's see here. I think a number of these questions will be touched on, and they're very good, but I think we're kind of getting ahead of the game here. Here's one for you, Rich, that's easy. Can you please comment on the NIOSH statement that NIOSH approval of RPD's devices does not apply to nuclear and radiologic hazards? If not, which agency is approving this kind of device?
You know, I'll let NIOSH handle that when they talk about the program, but I would say this. Typically, the way things are done here in the United States is NIOSH has respirator approval requirements for the basic requirements on the approval, but then there are federal agencies that may impose additional requirements for where the respirators are used within their jurisdiction. And so you're likely to see that DOE at some of the chemical waste storage sites might have additional requirements on the equipment that they're going to use above and beyond what NIOSH might require. I think that NIOSH respirator use against radiologic hazards is not eliminated from its program. The 42 CFR 84 requirement for particulate respirators right now, it applies to all particulates, and they use a worst case aerosol test under extreme conditions to approve the particulate filtering component of the respirator. So I wouldn't eliminate that, but I would say that other federal agencies may add additional requirements. And incidentally, it doesn't have to be a federal agency. We know that the National or the Fire Protection Association adds additional requirements to self-contained breathing apparatus for specific uses in the fire service. So typically you'd have a NIOSH approval on a self-contained breathing apparatus. And then the NFPA would also have a certification organization certify that the specific requirements of the NFPA are also met. It may have been an easy question, but it's not an easy answer.
You should see the other ones. I'm not pitching to you. So, colleagues, I just want to say I'm reading all the Q&As. Many of them are not the topic that Rich presented, and most of them are COVID related. I do think we are going to get into a little bit more of that. We have two colleagues from California who are going to talk about the airborne transmissible standard in California. So I promise, I think we're going to hit on it. It's just not going to be, I think, in this first session. Do any of the other panelists have a question for Rich before we let him off the hook? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, hi, Melissa. This is Bob Harrison. Thanks, Rich. Could you make another stab, if you would, at defining these terms, conformity assessment, certification, and approval? I think there's, at least for non-technical members of the audience and or the readers of this document in the context, particularly of COVID, when there's already a lot of confusion about the difference between a respirator and a mask, the sale of devices for respiratory protection in the United States that turned out not to be, I don't know what the word is, but shouldn't have been on the market and sold. I think there's a lot of confusion about what these terms mean. So, Rich, if I'm putting you on the spot, it probably is worth in this document having a glossary, because to the lay public, I think all these terms sound about the same.
I agree with you. First of all, so let me take a quick stab at it. I have a few minutes left before the next session. Conformity assessment is a large number of different types of activities that will be performed by potentially the supplier of the product. And the supplier will declare that they meet a standard. And so the user in that sort of a program has to make a decision on whether that first party declaration to a standard is an effective declaration, and in fact, it's the right standard. And there can be lots of other conformity assessment activities. Certification is a conformity assessment activity, but it involves an independent third party being the organization that makes that declaration, so there can be greater confidence that the user has an independent group who did the evaluations and made sure that the product conformed to the standard that the supplier declared. And then an approval is really a regulatory issue where a NIOSH approved respirator is required under OSHA rules and regulations to be used for occupational uses. In an approval program by NIOSH, it is concerned with all of the activities, starting with an identification of the hazard, a determination of the appropriate standards to address that hazard, and then an evaluation of the product to assure that that product conforms. And then the other thing that NIOSH does is it controls the certificate of approval. In other words, if NIOSH, for reason, finds that the product is not conforming and the manufacturer's system cannot produce conforming products, NIOSH can take away the certificate of approval and void the approval that it has granted. I do think we need definitions. That's why I started with the definition of conformity assessment in the beginning, because I find that most people think conformity assessment means certification. And they also think the certification means the first party. The supplier can make that declaration and it's a certification. That's not the case. You're right. We do need some clear definitions.
Melissa?
Yes.
This is John Balmes. I would like to ask Rich something, and it's actually echoing a question from one of the audience. So you clearly talked about NIOSH's central role in the conformity assessment, certification, approval. But since we are talking about respiratory protective gear for the public now, it seems that multiple agencies, the FDA, the EPA, and actually even CDC, the mothership of NIOSH, all have their hand in respiratory protection. And it seems like people aren't in these different agencies aren't talking to each other. Do you have any comments about that or suggestions?
Well, it's always difficult to have large organizations on exactly the same page. But some of the differences may be differences of opinion about the hazard or about the effective use. So there are legitimate differences among these organizations until there's a sufficient amount of research and data to support the appropriate direction. You might liken this to what we've heard about face coverings or respirators were not to be worn. and now they are to be worn. And whether a face covering is a source control or whether it's a respirator, and how much respiratory protection. A lot of that is because of the information about the hazard is evolving. So the recommendations are changing to appropriately respond. And some of it is the lack of the central authority to be able to give a single answer and base that on the limitations of the response. And I believe that it's extremely important for any approved product or certified product, or even a product that is self-declared to meet a standard, must have cautions, limitations, and restrictions of use. That's as important as what you should use it for.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Let me assure the colleagues that have written about other types of PPE that we are going to talk about other types of PPE. One of the other panelists loves to talk about the problems with gowns that one of the Q&A colleagues just typed in. So I promise that's going to get discussed. And we are going to talk about applying this approach to the public and the use of face coverings not considered respirators. So stay tuned. So thank you very much, Rich. Obviously, you instigated a lot of conversation, and people are waking up and not being shy anymore, and we're hearing from the participants. So that's all a good thing and what we wanted to happen.